A man who promised her a future stood her up at a dusty train station, then sent a note saying she wasn't good enough. Abigail Whitmore had sold everything she owned, crossed hundreds of miles of frontier, and arrived in Arizona with $11 to her name. No husband, no home, no way back. What happened next is something nobody in that territory ever forgot. If this story moves you, hit like, so I know it reached you. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far Abigail's story has traveled. And subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, because the stories only get better from here. The telegram had said 9 o'clock. Abigail Whitmore checked the paper again. Though she had read it so many times, the creases had worn soft as cloth. Arrive Cutter's Bend Station, Arizona Territory, September 4th, 1878. I will be waiting. R. Hargrove. It was now past 11. She sat on her trunk at the edge of the platform while the last of the other passengers dispersed into the dust and the heat. A mother and her children were met by a man with a wagon. A drummer type was already arguing with the station agent about a misrouted crate. Two cowboys leaned against the far wall, not waiting for anyone, just existing in that particular way men on the frontier existed. Slow, watchful, taking up space without apology. Abigail did not take up space. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her eyes fixed on the road leading into town, watching for a horse or a wagon or a man who matched the description she'd been given. Tall, fair-haired, 42 years of age, owner of the Hargrove cattle operation, 200 acres, prosperous and respectable. She watched the road. Nothing came. The station agent, a thin man named Cutter, she'd learned the town was named for his grandfather, stepped out and looked at her with the particular expression people reserve for stray animals and abandoned luggage. "You still here, miss?" "I am." "Expecting someone?" "Mr. Roland Hargrove." Something shifted in his face, not pity exactly, more like the involuntary wince of a man who knows something unpleasant and wishes he didn't. "You'd be the bride then," he said. She didn't answer that directly. She was not going to confirm or deny her status to a stranger on a platform. "I'm expected," she said. "There must be a delay." Cutter rubbed the back of his neck. "Miss, I don't rightly know how to say this, so I'll just say it plain. Roland Hargrove was here this morning, early. He waited maybe an hour, then rode off. But before he left, he stopped in my office and asked me to—" He paused. "He asked me to give you this." He held out a folded note. Abigail stared at it for a moment before she took it. The paper was cheap, the handwriting rushed. She read it once. Then she read it again because the first time didn't make it real. "Miss Whitmore, I have been informed by parties in St. Louis that you are not the woman you presented yourself to be. I cannot in good conscience proceed with our arrangement. I wish you no ill, but I will not be writing again. Do not come to my property. R.H." That was all. No explanation of what he'd heard, no name of who told him, no chance to answer the accusation, whatever it was, because he hadn't stayed long enough to look her in the face. She folded the note. She folded it again. She pressed it flat against her knee and stared at the road he'd ridden away on. And she thought, "I sold my mother's brooch for the train ticket. I gave up my room at Mrs. Farley's boarding house. I have $11.40 to my name, and no one in this territory who knows I exist." "Miss," Cutter said. "Thank you," she said, "for delivering it personally." She said it without sarcasm, because there was no point in sarcasm. He hadn't done anything wrong. He lingered a moment, like he might say something more, then thought better of it and went back inside. Abigail sat with the folded note in her hand and the sun hammering down on the platform roof and the distant sound of someone's chickens somewhere in town, and she tried very hard to think clearly. She had grown up in St. Louis, the second of 4 daughters of a man who ran a modest dry goods store, until he didn't. Until the store failed, and then his health failed, and then he failed, and her mother had managed the household on what Abigail and her sisters brought in from taking in mending and washing. She was 26 years old. She had been offered precisely one opportunity in her life that had looked like a real future, and it had dissolved before she could even step off the platform. Informed by parties in St. Louis. She turned the phrase over in her mind. There was only one party in St. Louis who might have taken it upon themselves to interfere with her marriage arrangement. Only one person who stood to benefit from her leaving and then failing to land anywhere safe. Her sister's husband, Gerald Pruitt. Gerald, who had made it plain since the day he married Clara that Abigail's presence in any household adjacent to his was an insult to his dignity. Gerald, who had connections among the merchant class in St. Louis and who knew how to make a word placed in the right ear travel a long way. Gerald, who had smiled at her the morning she left and said, "Safe travels, Abigail. I do hope it works out for you." She had believed him. She was not going to think about Gerald Pruitt right now. She was going to think about what came next, which was the only productive use of her mind at this moment. What came next was a short list. She could try to find work in Cutter's Bend, if there was any, and save enough money to get back to St. Louis. She could try to send a telegram to the women's placement agency that had arranged her match and ask for another placement. She could, and this was the option her stomach rejected flatly, she could go to Roland Hargrove's property and demand to know what exactly he'd been told and by whom. She was in the middle of considering and discarding each of these options when she heard boots on the platform behind her. "Abigail Whitmore?" She turned. The man standing there was not what she would have called remarkable in any single quality, but something about the combination of him was hard to look away from. He was somewhere north of 30, with the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor years until it settled into something angular and permanent. Dark eyes that assessed a situation without broadcasting what they found. A posture that wasn't aggressive, just planted. Like a man who had decided where he was standing and didn't plan to be moved. He held his hat in one hand. That alone made her soften slightly. The instinct to take off a hat when speaking to a woman was not universal on the frontier in her experience. "I've been looking for you," he said. The words landed strangely, given the morning she'd had. "I don't know you," she said. "No, ma'am. Name's Silas Boone. I work for a man named Everett Calhoun out at Iron Hollow Settlement, about 3 days' ride north and west. Mr. Calhoun got word you were coming through on this train, and he asked me to come meet you." She waited. She had learned that waiting often produced more information than questions. Silas Boone reached inside his vest and produced a letter. He held it out. He wrote it out himself. Figured you might not take the word of a stranger without something on paper. She took the letter and read it. The handwriting was deliberate and legible, the penmanship of a man who'd taught himself to write carefully and didn't trust himself to do it fast. "Miss Whitmore, you don't know me, but I have heard of your situation through mutual acquaintance. Iron Hollow is a settlement of 18 families in the Maricopa Highlands that is in need of a school teacher and a woman of practical capability. I cannot offer you wealth. I can offer you honest wages, a room of your own, and a community that will judge you by what you do and not by what someone in St. Louis decided to say about you. If you'll trust my man Silas to bring you here safe, I believe you'll find this a fair offer. Everett Calhoun, Iron Hollow." She read it twice. Then she looked up at Silas Boone, who had put his hat back on and was watching her with the patient expression of a man who has delivered the message and will now wait as long as it takes. "How does Everett Calhoun know about my situation?" she asked. "He didn't say. Mr. Calhoun knows a lot of things. He's that kind of man." "And what kind of man are you?" He didn't hesitate. "The kind that was hired to bring you there safe and will." "That's not an answer to the question I asked." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "No," he admitted. "It's not." She looked at the road again. She thought about $11.40. She thought about St. Louis and Gerald Pruitt's smile. She thought about the fact that she had burned her passage back the moment she gave up her room at Mrs. Farley's, and that Cutter's Bend had the look of a town where a single woman with no connections and no money would find precisely one kind of work available to her. She looked at Silas Boone. "When do we leave?" she said. He blinked once, like that wasn't quite the response he'd expected at this speed. "Tomorrow morning, early. We'll need to get you supplies tonight." "I don't have much money." "Mr. Calhoun sent funds for the outfitting. It'll come out of your first wages, if that suits you." "It suits me." She stood and picked up the handle of her trunk. "I'll need somewhere to sleep tonight." There's a boarding house on the main street. Decent. She nodded. She picked up her trunk. It was heavy. She had packed like a woman intending to stay somewhere, and she walked off the platform without looking back at the empty road Roland Hargrove had ridden away on. Silas Boone watched her go for a moment, then moved to take the trunk. She didn't relinquish it immediately. "I can carry it," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I'm offering anyway." She let him take it. The boarding house was run by a woman named Dora, 60s, iron-haired, the kind of woman who communicated her opinions through facial expression alone and seemed to feel that explanations were a weakness. She gave Abigail a clean room and a plate of supper without being asked and charged her 50 cents, which was fair. Abigail ate alone at a small table near the window and listened to the town settle into evening. Somewhere down the street, a piano was playing something cheerful and slightly wrong. Men's voices. Laughter that was probably going to turn into something else before midnight. She thought about the letter. "I can offer you honest wages, a room of your own, and a community that will judge you by what you do and not by what someone in St. Louis decided to say about you. It could be genuine. It could also be a different kind of trap. A man who wanted cheap labor and had found an efficient way to acquire it. Women alone on the frontier were not scarce targets, but the letter had felt specific. The handwriting had felt like a real man, not a performance. And Silas Boone, whatever else he was, had not looked at her the way men looked at women they were planning to exploit. He had looked at her like someone he had been asked to collect and intended to deliver. No more, no less. She was aware that this might be exactly what a very skilled deceiver would look like. She was also aware that she had approximately $11, no position, no references in this territory, and tomorrow morning she either got on a horse headed toward an unknown settlement, or she stayed in Cutter's Bend and started figuring out how to survive in a town that had no particular reason to help her. She had made harder decisions than this one. She folded Hargrove's note and placed it at the very bottom of her trunk, under everything else. In the corner she used for things she needed to keep but not see. Silas was waiting outside the boarding house at 5:30 in the morning with 2 horses and her trunk already loaded onto a pack animal. He had brought provisions. He had also, she noticed, brought a rifle, which was secured in a scabbard on his saddle, and which he did not mention or draw attention to. "You ride?" he asked. "Not well," she said. "Well enough is enough." She mounted the horse he'd brought for her with more determination than grace, and they rode out of Cutter's Bend while the sky was still pale gray and the chickens were just beginning to register an opinion about the dawn. For the first 2 hours they rode in silence, which suited Abigail. She was using the time to assess the horse, the terrain, the man riding ahead of her, the distance between herself and everything familiar. The Arizona Territory in the early morning was not what she had imagined from St. Louis. She had imagined desolation, and there was that, certainly. But there was also a kind of raw amplitude to it. The sky went further than she'd expected. The colors in the rock were more varied. The silence was not empty. It was occupied by wind and distant bird sounds and the soft percussion of hooves on packed earth. She did not romanticize this. She was on a horse she didn't know how to ride well, headed toward people she didn't know, because a man she'd never met had rejected her on the basis of a rumor, and her options were thin. That was the truth of her situation. She was not going to dress it up. Around mid-morning, Silas dropped back to ride beside her rather than ahead. He didn't announce this change. He just adjusted his pace. "You do that a lot?" he said after a while. "Do what?" "Look at things like you're taking inventory." She considered this. "I suppose I do." "Not a criticism," he said. "I didn't take it as one." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You're not going to ask me about myself?" "I assumed you'd tell me what was relevant when it became relevant," she said. "Is there something relevant?" Another near smile. "Not yet." "Then I'll wait." The first trouble came on the second day, in the early afternoon, when the trail narrowed through a passage between 2 rock walls, and Silas pulled up his horse without warning and sat very still. Abigail stopped beside him. She looked where he was looking and saw nothing but the trail ahead and the rock. "What is it?" she said quietly. "Stay here," he said. That's not. But he was already moving forward, slow and quiet, his hand near the rifle scabbard, but not on it. She watched him ride to the narrowest point of the passage and stop there, looking at something she couldn't see from her angle. She heard voices. Two of them, male, the tone of men having a conversation they didn't want overheard, then silence. Then Silas's voice, level and conversational. Afternoon. A pause. We're just passing through, one of the other voices said. So are we, Silas said. Plenty of room. Another pause, longer, then the sound of horses moving, away, not toward. She heard them recede and then disappear. Silas came back to her. Shortcuts clear, he said. Who were they? Men looking for easy opportunities. Were we an easy opportunity? They decided not. She wanted to ask more. She looked at his face and decided the asking would not produce more information than she currently had. All right, she said. They rode through the passage. On the other side, she looked back once and saw nothing on the trail behind them. That night, camped in the shelter of a rock overhang with a small fire between them, she asked him the question she'd been circling since Cutter's Bend. Mr. Calhoun's letter said I was recommended by a mutual acquaintance. Who? Silas was looking at the fire. He took a moment before answering, and she had already learned that his pauses were not stalls. He was deciding how much to say. Woman named Patience Aldrich, he said, runs a placement agency out of Denver. She and Mr. Calhoun have done business before. He's helped place a few women in Iron Hollow who needed a start and had nowhere obvious to go. Decent women who'd run out of decent options. He collects strays, Abigail said. Silas looked at her. He'd say he collects capable people that other people were fool enough to let go. She thought about that. And you? How long have you worked for him? This pause was longer. 4 years, he said. And before that? The fire popped. Silas picked up a stick and pushed a coal back toward the center. Before that, I wasn't the kind of man who worked for people like Everett Calhoun. She waited. I made some bad choices when I was young, he said. Fell in with men who weren't careful about whose property was whose. Spent 2 years in a territorial prison. He said it flat, without self-pity and without defensiveness, like a man stating his height. When I got out, Calhoun gave me work and didn't ask me to be ashamed of it every day, so I stayed. Abigail looked at the fire. I'm telling you because you ought to know who you're riding with, he said, not asking for your opinion of it. I don't have one, she said. Not yet. Fair enough. She pulled her blanket around her shoulders. I was accused of being unfit, she said, by someone back in St. Louis who stood to gain from me failing. I don't know exactly what was said. Something about my character, my family, something that was either a lie or a misrepresentation. Hargrove believed it without asking me. Men like Hargrove usually do, Silas said. Easier to believe a rumor than to trouble yourself finding out if it's true. Yes, she said. Easier. You know who started it? I have a good guess. You going to do something about it? She looked at him across the fire. Eventually, she said. He nodded once and went back to looking at the coals, and she lay down on her bedroll and listened to the desert make its night sounds and thought about Iron Hollow and what it might be, and what she might be willing to become in order to build something real out of what remained of her options. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. On the third day, the terrain changed. The flat hardpan gave way to lower hills, and the hills to something greener, not lush, not by any measure, but alive in a way the desert hadn't been. Scrub oak, patches of grass that had survived the summer, a creek that crossed their path twice, shallow and cold, and the horses drank from it with evident satisfaction. Abigail's thighs ached from 3 days of riding. She did not mention this. Around noon, Silas pointed ahead to where the trail curved around a long slope. Iron Hollow's over that ridge, he said. She looked at the ridge. What will I find there? 18 families, maybe 60, 70 people. Some have been there 10 years, some arrived 6 months ago. They've got a meeting house, a livery, a general store that's barely got enough stock to call itself that, and a schoolhouse someone started building 3 years ago that nobody ever finished. Why not? The man who started it died. Fever. His wife moved her children east after that. Nobody else picked it up. What do the children do for schooling? They don't. She took this in. And the land trouble. Calhoun's letter mentioned, "He'll tell you himself," Silas said. "I'm not the right person to explain it." She recognized this as a boundary and didn't push it. They rode over the ridge, and Iron Hollow opened below them, small, scattered, the buildings looking like they'd been placed by people who were moving fast and planning to adjust later. But there was smoke from chimneys, there were horses in a pen, there was the sound, faint but real, of children's voices somewhere in the settlement below. Abigail Whitmore looked at it for a long moment. She had come here expecting to become someone's wife. She had arrived at Cutter's Bend expecting a husband and found a rejection note. She had accepted a stranger's offer because she was out of alternatives. And now, looking down at this small, imperfect, struggling place, she felt something shift in her chest that she didn't have a clean name for. Not hope exactly. She was too practical for hope on this little evidence. Something more like the feeling of seeing a problem that needed solving and recognizing, in some deep and unargued way, that she was the kind of person who could solve it. She didn't say any of this to Silas. She just clicked her heels against the horse's sides and rode down toward Iron Hollow. Silas watched her for a moment before following, and there was something in his expression that nobody would have seen from where she was sitting, something that looked, if you were being honest about it, a great deal like relief. Everett Calhoun was not what she'd built him up to be in her mind. She had imagined someone imposing, a large man, the way men who commanded respect in frontier settlements often were, built to fill a doorway and comfortable with it. Instead, the man who walked out of the meeting house to greet them was somewhere in his mid-50s, slight, with a noticeable limp in his left leg, and the careful movements of someone who had learned to compensate for an old injury without making it anyone's business. His hair was white at the temples and needed cutting. His handshake was firm. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I'm glad Silas found you." "He did," she said. "Your letter was specific." "I try to be." He looked at her with clear, direct eyes that reminded her of a schoolteacher she'd had at 12, the kind of man who saw more than he commented on. "You had a hard arrival." "I did." "Well," he turned and gestured toward the meeting house. "Come have something to eat, and I'll tell you what I can offer and what I can't, and you can tell me if it suits you. No obligations until after that conversation." She followed him inside. Silas did not follow. She noticed him handing the horses off to a young man who appeared from the direction of the livery, and then he walked toward a long, low building she assumed was a bunkhouse, and she felt, briefly, absurdly, something that she immediately diagnosed as being less comfortable than she'd expected at his departure. She filed this away in the category of things to examine later and focused on Calhoun. The meeting house had a long table down the center with mismatched chairs and benches, a wood stove at the far end that was producing more smoke than warmth, and two women in the corner who appeared to be sorting dried beans with the focused energy of people who had decided to work through whatever was happening in the room rather than be seen paying attention to it. They were absolutely paying attention. A bowl of stew appeared in front of her. She didn't ask where it came from. She ate. Calhoun sat across from her with a cup of coffee he didn't drink and talked. He told her about Iron Hollow the way a man talks about something he loves that's been giving him trouble, say, plainly, without excuses, but with an undercurrent of investment that no amount of practical language could quite conceal. The settlement had been established 11 years ago by a group of families who'd come out of Texas and New Mexico looking for grazing land that wasn't already claimed. They'd found the Hollow, a valley ringed by low hills with 2 reliable water sources and good grass, and they'd built. For the first 6-7 years it worked, Calhoun said. People stayed, families grew, we got the store, the livery. We were maybe 2 years from petitioning for a post office. "What changed?" Abigail said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "A man named Harlan Voss decided this valley was worth having." She waited. "He's got backing from a land development company out of Tucson. Big money. They're looking to consolidate rangeland and sell it to Eastern investors who want cattle operations without the inconvenience of actually living on the frontier." Calhoun's mouth tightened. Voss has been buying up liens, pressuring families with debt, and when that doesn't work, he finds other ways to make people want to leave. "What other ways?" "Fences cut, water sources fouled, livestock gone missing, Last spring, Dale Morrow's barn burned. Nobody saw who did it, but Dale had refused Voss's offer the week before. He said it without drama. Just facts placed in a row. 3 families have already sold and moved. 2 more are thinking about it. If we lose 5 families, the ones who stay start wondering if they picked the wrong side. And the law? Calhoun looked at her with something that was not quite a smile. The territorial marshal's office is in Prescott. 3 days' ride. They have opinions about land disputes between settlers and development interests, and those opinions favor whoever has the better lawyer, which is not us. Abigail thought about this. And you think a schoolteacher helps with this how? The children of Iron Hollow are growing up without education, Calhoun said. That matters to families. It's one of the reasons some of them are tempted by Voss's offers. They want something better for their kids, and better means schooling, and there's none here. He looked at her directly. You give these people's children a future they can see, they'll fight harder for the land that gives their kids that future. That's not a theory. That's how people work. She considered this. It was pragmatic, maybe even a little cold in the way it framed education as a tool for something else. But it was also not wrong. You said honest wages, she said. What does that mean in numbers? He told her. It was not a large number. It was, however, more than 0, which was what she currently had. Room of your own, she said. The Morrow family has a room at the back of their house. Martha Morrow is good people. She lost a daughter 3 years ago, and I think she'd— He paused. She'd appreciate the company, if it suits you both. I'll need to meet her before I agree to that. Of course, she nodded. And the schoolhouse. Needs work. It's got walls and a roof. No floor to speak of. No desks. No books. I have books, she said, in my trunk. I brought what I could. Calhoun looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. You packed books, he said. I packed for a life, she said, not a visit. He picked up his coffee cup and finally drank from it, and she had the sense that something had been decided in the room that hadn't been spoken aloud. Teat. Martha Morrow was a woman in her late 40s who had the look of someone who had been tested so many times that the testing had burned away everything except what was essential, and what remained was considerable. She met Abigail at her front door with the evaluating look of a woman who had no time or inclination for pleasantries and would make up her mind about a person in the first 3 minutes. You're younger than I expected, Martha said. I'm 26, Abigail said. You look it. This did not appear to be a compliment. Can you cook? Adequately. Can you sleep through a coyote? I don't know yet. Martha looked at her for another moment, then stepped aside from the door. Room's at the back. It's small. There's a window, but it sticks when it's hot and won't close all the way when it rains. There's a hook on the door that works if you lift it right. Thank you, Abigail said. Don't thank me yet. Martha turned back toward the kitchen. Supper's at 6. I don't wait. The room was small, as promised. The window stuck. The hook on the door required a particular upward pressure before it caught. The mattress had seen better years, but there was a shelf on the wall and a square of genuine floor, and when Abigail set her trunk in the corner and placed 3 of her books on the shelf, it became, in some provisional and impermanent way, hers. She stood at the sticking window and looked out at Iron Hollow in the late afternoon light and thought, all right, this is what there is. Now figure out what to do with it. She found the schoolhouse the next morning on her own. Calhoun had offered to show her, but she'd told him she'd rather see it unaccompanied first, and he'd accepted this without question, which raised him slightly in her estimation. It was on the north end of the settlement, set back from the main track by maybe 30 yards. Whoever had built it had done so with intention. The walls were solid, the roof hadn't collapsed, and someone had once made a real attempt at a proper doorframe. But the door itself had warped in its frame and wouldn't open from the outside without being persuaded. And when she finally got it open, the inside smelled of old damp and mouse and time. There was no floor. Packed earth, hardened by years of weather coming through the single glassless window on the east wall. There were 2 rough benches that might seat 4 children each if they were friendly about it, and nothing else. A wasp nest occupied one corner of the ceiling. Something small and alive was active in the wall near the door. Abigail stood in the middle of the earthen floor with her hands on her hips and took inventory. She needed floorboards, glass for the window, or at minimum a shutter that could close, desks or tables, more benches, a means of heating the room in winter, slates for the children, or paper and pencils, or both, a blackboard of some kind. 2, maybe 3 weeks of work before the space was usable. She had 3 weeks. She went and found Dale Morrow, Martha's husband, who turned out to be a large, quiet man with sawdust perpetually in his hair and the careful hands of someone who had been working with wood since he was a boy. She asked him what lumber was available in Iron Hollow and whether anyone could be spared to help with the schoolhouse floor. He looked at her the way men on the frontier frequently looked at her, assessing, uncertain whether to be helpful or to explain that she didn't understand how things worked here. She waited. "I've got some planks seasoned out back," he said finally. "Been sitting there since," he stopped. "Since my daughter died. She was going to be your age about now." Abigail didn't say she was sorry, because she had learned that "I'm sorry" in situations like this often served the speaker more than the recipient. Instead, she said, "Would it be all right to use them?" Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, it'd be all right." By the end of the first week, she had met most of the families of Iron Hollow, and Iron Hollow had met her, and the process had been approximately as awkward as such things generally are. Several of the women were warm from the beginning. Martha, once she'd determined that Abigail would not require managing, became a reliable ally. A young woman named Sarah Luz, Mexican-born and ferociously competent, brought Abigail a jar of something preserved and spicy the second day, and attached herself with a matter-of-fact friendliness that Abigail found more genuinely comfortable than any careful welcome would have been. Other people were slower. Some of the men treated her with a formal politeness that was mostly uncertainty about what she was and how she functioned in the settlement's social structure. Not the wife anyone had sent for, not quite an employee in any category they recognized. A few of the older women had the guarded look of people who had been let down before and had adjusted their expectations accordingly. A man named Gus Teller, who ran the general store and seemed to consider himself the settlement's informal voice on community matters, asked her point blank at the end of her third day what exactly she'd done back in St. Louis and why she'd come out here through a mail-order arrangement. She told him the outline. She didn't embellish it or apologize for it. "Hargrove rejected you," Gus said, with the directness of a man who considers social friction a sign of weakness. "He did. On account of rumors." "That's right. And you don't know exactly what those rumors said." "I have a reasonable guess." Gus looked at her steadily. "People here have had things said about them too," he said, "by Voss's people. Said old Mercer drank. Said the Luce family doesn't actually own their deed. Said Dale Morrow burned his own barn for the insurance money, which is a particular kind of low if you knew Dale." He paused. "What I'm saying is, we know what a rumor looks like out here. Doesn't mean we stop caring about whether things are true." "I'd expect you to stop caring about whether rumors are true," Abigail said. "I'd expect you to care about whether I do my job." Gus looked at her for another long moment, then nodded once and went back to counting his stock. She didn't see much of Silas in those first days. He existed in the settlement the way a piece of furniture exists in a room you haven't fully mapped yet. You knew it was there, you were occasionally aware of it, but it didn't demand your attention. He worked for Calhoun, which appeared to mean a wide variety of things. She saw him helping with fence repairs, talking to ranchers on horseback at the edge of the settlement, once carrying a message out of town at speed in a way that suggested something had needed handling quickly. It was on the 6th evening that she encountered him at the water trough behind the livery while she was filling a bucket for the schoolhouse. She'd been hauling water each evening to soften the packed earth floor before Dale came to lay the planks, and the route took her past the livery. Silas was there rubbing down his horse, which was damp from recent hard riding. "Long day," she said. "Long enough." He didn't stop what he was doing. "How's the schoolhouse coming?" "Dale starts the floor tomorrow." "He's good with wood." "I noticed." There was a pause that was comfortable in the particular way of two people who had established over 3 days of hard travel that they did not need to fill silences with each other. "I heard you talk to Gus Teller," Silas said. "News travels." "In Iron Hollow it does." He moved around to the horse's other side. He say anything worth worrying about? He asked questions and seemed satisfied with the answers. She picked up her bucket. Is Gus someone I should worry about? Silas considered. He's someone who decides things around here. Not officially, just when Gus makes up his mind about a person, other people tend to follow. If he decided against you, you'd have had a harder road. And has he decided? He asked me about you this morning, Silas said. Asked what you were like on the trail. What did you tell him? He looked at her over the horse's back. I told him you carried your own trunk, he said. She laughed, short, real, the first time she'd laughed in what felt like a month. It surprised her as much as it appeared to surprise him. That's a high recommendation in Gus Teller's world, she said. It really is, Silas said, and there was something in his voice that had not been there on the trail. Something that was still careful but slightly less guarded, the way a door looks when it's been unlocked but not yet opened. She picked up her bucket and walked back toward the schoolhouse. She did not look back, but she was aware, in the specific way you are aware of something you are choosing not to examine too closely, that she was thinking about that laugh for longer than was probably necessary. The trouble arrived, as trouble usually does, not dramatically but casually, on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in the schoolhouse with Dale. The floor was going in, half done, the smell of fresh lumber doing more than anything else to make the space feel real, when she heard horses on the main track, more than two. The kind of movement that made people who'd been paying attention in a frontier settlement stop what they were doing. She stepped outside. There were 4 of them, dressed better than working cowboys dress, in the particular way of men employed as muscle by people with money. Clean enough to be taken seriously, rough enough to be taken seriously for different reasons. They rode to the center of the settlement and stopped, and the one in front, a wide man with a red beard, and the relaxed posture of someone accustomed to being the largest physical presence in a given space, looked around Iron Hollow with the expression of a man surveying property he already considers his own. Who speaks for this settlement? He said, loud enough that it wasn't a question so much as a summons. Calhoun came out of the meeting house. He walked with his limp and his unhurried pace and stopped in the middle of the track. I do, often enough, he said. What can I do for you? Name's Cord Dalloway, the red-bearded man said. I represent Harlan Voss and the Consolidated Western Land Company. Mr. Voss wanted me to ride out personally and let you all know that his offer to purchase the properties in this settlement remains on the table. He's extended the timeline by 30 days. That's generous, Calhoun said. It is. Dalloway looked around at the people who had gathered, and they had gathered, in the quiet, sideways manner of people who want to see what's happening without seeming to want to see. Mr. Voss is aware that some of you may have concerns about the terms. He's prepared to discuss them. He's also, Dalloway paused with the timing of a man who has rehearsed this, made to me aware of certain title irregularities on a number of properties in this valley. He's prepared to overlook those irregularities in the case of sellers. In the case of people who don't sell, those irregularities may need to be referred to the Territorial Land Office. Silence. The kind that has weight. Calhoun's face didn't change. Thank you for writing out, he said. We'll give Mr. Voss's offer the consideration it deserves. Dalloway held his gaze for a moment, then looked past Calhoun at the settlement, the houses, the livery, the meeting house, the partially repaired schoolhouse at the north end. His gaze landed on Abigail standing outside the schoolhouse door, and he looked at her the way you look at something that doesn't belong in a picture you already have in your mind. Nice to see improvements being made, he said. That kind of investment will add to the sale value. He turned his horse and rode out, and the 3 men with him followed, and Iron Hollow stood and breathed and said nothing for a moment. Then Gus Teller said, at normal volume, but with a precision that carried, title irregularities. He just told us they've had someone looking through our paperwork. They've had someone looking through our paperwork for a while, Calhoun said. Let's go inside. The meeting that night was not calm. Abigail sat in the back corner of the meeting house and listened while people who had held themselves together through months of pressure finally started to come apart at the edges. A man named Hector Luz, Sarah's father-in-law, a rancher with 700 acres and a slow burn of anger that he kept very well contained, said he'd gotten a visit from Dalloway's men 2 weeks ago and hadn't told anyone because he thought he could handle it himself. Dale Morrow said that his deed had been in his family since '67, and he dared anyone to find an irregularity in it, but his voice was not as steady as his words. An older woman named Bess Calloway said what everyone was thinking, which was that if Voss had lawyers going through their land records, they were already playing a game they weren't equipped to win. Calhoun let people talk. He was good at that. The kind of man who understood that people needed to hear their own fears spoken aloud before they could think past them. When it had quieted some, he said, "We need our own documentation. Every deed, every bill of sale, every record of improvement, every survey marker. We gather copies, we verify them, and we find out exactly what Voss thinks he's found before he can use it against us." "That's a lot of paper to read," Gus said. "It is," Calhoun agreed. He looked toward the back corner. Abigail met his gaze. "I understand," he said carefully, "that Miss Whitmore has some experience with record-keeping and document review." She did not remember mentioning this to Calhoun. She also noticed that several faces in the room turned toward her with expressions ranging from skeptical to openly dubious, which was a familiar experience and one she had learned to receive without reacting to. "I do," she said. "My father kept a dry goods store. I kept his books for 6 years before the business failed." "That's store accounts," said one of the men near the front, "not land records." "A document is a document," Abigail said. "A discrepancy is a discrepancy. What matters is knowing what you're looking at and what you're looking for." She paused. "Bring me everything you have. I'll start in the morning." The man who'd objected looked like he wanted to say something else. He glanced at Calhoun, who was looking at Abigail with an expression that did not offer rescue. The man looked back at Abigail. "All right," he said, with the tone of a man who has decided to be proven wrong at a convenient future date. She started with the Morrow deed because Dale trusted her and she needed to establish a process before she could work fast. She sat at the long table in the meeting house with a lamp close and the deed spread out and a piece of paper for notes beside it, and she read the entire document twice before she wrote a single word. She was still there at midnight. Martha appeared at 10 with coffee, said nothing, and left. Silas appeared at 11. She heard the door, looked up, and found him there with his hat in his hand, which she had come to understand was a habit of his that he performed without thinking. "Calhoun asked me to check if you needed anything," he said. "Another lamp," she said, "and someone who knows when each of these properties was first claimed, in order, because the territorial survey records use a numbering system that doesn't match the local records, and I need to reconcile them." He looked at what she had spread across the table. "That's a lot of paper." "It is." "Do you know the claim history?" "Some of it." He came to the table and looked at the survey map she'd placed in the center. His finger moved across it. "This line's wrong," he said. She looked where he was pointing. "The survey marker for the Teller property? Should be 20 yards further east. I know because I helped Gus set it 3 years ago. We did it right." "Which means either the original survey was wrong or someone has amended this copy," she said. "Or both," Silas said. She looked up at him. He was looking at the map with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the watchful, contained look he usually carried, but something more focused, angry, under the surface. The kind of anger that comes from watching something unfair happen to people you care about and not having had, until this moment, a precise instrument to work with. "Sit down," she said. "I need to know everything you know about who arrived here and when, and what paperwork changed hands." He sat down. He talked. She wrote. The lamp burned low and she trimmed it, and it burned lower still. And outside, Iron Hollow was dark and quiet. And inside that meeting house, 2 people who had ridden 3 days across difficult country and had not entirely figured out what they were to each other, worked through the night on something that mattered, and that was enough for now. It was past 2 in the morning when she set down her pen and pressed her fingers against her eyes and said, "There are at least 4 properties where the recorded boundaries don't match the original claim markers. Voss has had someone alter the copies he has access to. The originals, the ones in this room right now, are clean." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Can you prove the alteration?" "If I can get the original territorial survey records from the land office in Prescott, yes. They'll show what was filed. Whatever Voss's copies say, the filed originals are the legal record. She lowered her hands. Someone needs to ride to Prescott. That's 3 days each way. I know. He looked at her. Voss's 30-day window starts now. I know that too. He stood up, and she stood up, and they were close enough in the lamplight that she could see the tiredness in his face, and under it, something steadier. The expression of a man who has decided what he's going to do and is at peace with the decision. I'll leave at first light, he said. Be careful, she said. And then, because it came out more personally than she'd intended, and she didn't want to leave it hanging awkwardly. We need those records intact. Yes, he said, and there was the smallest edge of something in his voice that suggested he understood perfectly well what she'd been saying and what she'd been meaning and was choosing, for now, to let her claim the practical version. We do. He walked out. She stood at the table in the low lamplight and looked at the spread of documents and felt not confident exactly, not afraid exactly. Something more like a person standing at the edge of a thing that is genuinely difficult, with a clear enough view of the path forward and enough stubbornness to take the next step. She blew out the lamp and walked back through the dark settlement to Martha Morrow's house, and she lay down on the mattress that had seen better years, and this time she slept without difficulty at all. Silas left before the settlement was fully awake. Abigail heard his horse from the back room at Martha's house. The particular sound of a single rider moving with purpose through the pre-dawn quiet, hooves on dry earth fading north toward the Prescott Road. She lay still for a moment, listening to it go, and then she got up, because there was work to do, and lying in bed thinking about what could go wrong with a 6-day round trip through uncertain country was not a productive use of the morning. She was at the schoolhouse by the time the light was strong enough to work by. Dale had finished the floor the previous afternoon. Rough planks, not pretty, but solid and level, and the smell of the fresh wood had done something to the space that she hadn't anticipated. It made it feel inhabited, like a place that had a future in mind. She stood on it now in the early light and heard it take her weight without complaint, and she thought about what needed to happen in the next 6 days before Silas returned, assuming the roads held and nothing went wrong. She had 14 children to account for. She knew this because she'd spent part of the previous week going house to house introducing herself, and at each house she'd asked about children and their ages and what, if any, schooling they'd had. The answers ranged from 2 families where the mothers had taught their children to read from a Bible and a mail-order almanac to 3 families where the children had never held a pencil. Ages ran from 6 to 15. It was not a classroom. It was a small, complicated population with wildly different needs and no common baseline. She had worked with worse. She had never actually worked with this, she reminded herself. She had helped her younger sisters learn to read. She had helped her father with arithmetic. She had read voraciously and retained most of what she read. None of this was the same as standing in front of 14 children and being responsible for what they knew at the end of it. She pushed this thought to the side and focused on the bench arrangement. The first morning of school arrived 4 days after Silas left, which was the earliest she could honestly call the space ready. The floor was swept. The east window had a proper shutter now. Hector Luce had appeared 2 mornings ago with materials and a matter-of-fact competence that suggested Sarah had told him to go be useful. There were 6 benches. There was a length of dark-painted board nailed to the wall at the front that served as a blackboard. There were 3 pieces of chalk and 14 slates that Calhoun had, without being asked, arranged to have brought from Prescott on a supply run 2 weeks prior, as if he'd been planning for this longer than he'd let on. The children arrived in clusters, by family, with the particular energy of people who have been told to behave and are therefore vibrating slightly with the effort of it. The youngest was a girl named Polly Morrow, Dale and Martha's granddaughter, 6 years old, with a serious face and the habit of standing very still and watching things before she committed to them, which Abigail recognized as a sound policy. The oldest was a boy named Trace Teller, Gus's son, 15, who arrived last and stood in the doorway for a moment with the expression of someone who had decided in advance that this was beneath him. "Come in or don't," Abigail said, without looking up from what she was writing on the board. "But if you come in, sit down." He came in. He sat down, in the back, with his arms crossed. She made a note of this and moved on. She started with what they knew, because that was the only honest way to start. She asked them questions. She listened to the answers. She was patient with the ones who didn't know, and careful not to make the ones who did feel superior about it, because a classroom where some children felt superior to others became unmanageable in ways that had nothing to do with learning. By mid-morning, she had a rough map of the room in her head. Who could read, who could cipher, who was quick and hit it, who was slow and knew it and was afraid. Trace Teller, she discovered, could read better than anyone else in the room, including the adults who occasionally appeared in the doorway to observe. He had been pretending otherwise. She did not call attention to this. She gave him a harder text and watched him work through it and did not react to how fast he finished. At the end of the morning session, when the others were filing out for the midday break, she stopped him. "You've had schooling before," she said. He shrugged. "Some." "Where?" "My mother's people, back in New Mexico, before we came out here." Something moved through his expression that he didn't quite manage to conceal. Something complicated that had to do with whatever had happened between New Mexico and here. "It was a while ago." "It stuck," she said. He looked at her with a 15-year-old's particular suspicion of a compliment. "My pa doesn't see the point," he said. "Out here." "Your pa built a store," Abigail said. "He keeps accounts. He orders stock. He writes letters to suppliers. He's been using the education someone gave him his whole adult life, and he doesn't see the point of giving you the same thing." She said this without heat, just as a statement of something observable. That seems like a gap in his thinking. Trace stared at her. He was not accustomed, she guessed, to adults in Iron Hollow speaking about his father's thinking in terms of gaps. "You going to tell him you said that?" he asked. "Not unless you do," she said. He left, but he came back after the midday break, and he stopped sitting with his arms crossed. Get. The day Silas was supposed to return came and went without him. Abigail noted this and said nothing to anyone. There were a dozen reasonable explanations: the roads, the land office timeline, any number of small delays that added up to one extra day. She taught school in the morning and worked on the settlement's documents in the evening and did not allow herself to construct scenarios. On the second day past his expected return, Calhoun came to the meeting house while she was working and sat down across from her without preamble. "He's 2 days late," he said. "I know. There's a man named Reeves who sometimes rides that road for hire. I can send him out to look." "If something had happened on the road, we'd likely have heard something by now," Abigail said. "Travelers talk. Word moves faster than we think out here." She looked at the map on the table. More likely he got to Prescott and found the land office process slower than expected. Government offices don't accommodate urgency. Calhoun was quiet for a moment. "You're probably right." "I'm not certain," she said. "I'm reasoning with what I have." He nodded. He sat a while longer, which was unusual for him. Calhoun was not a man who lingered without purpose. "Voss is coming himself," he said. "Got word this afternoon. He's riding out in 4 days with his lawyers and a territorial land agent he's apparently convinced to make the trip." Abigail set down her pen. "A territorial agent. If the agent certifies his version of the boundaries, we've got a harder fight on our hands. Takes it out of the realm of he said we said and into official record. Then we need Silas back with the Prescott documents before Voss gets here." "Yes," Calhoun said. "We do." She looked at the map. She looked at the 4 properties she had flagged with discrepancies. She had done everything she could do from this side of the problem. The rest of it required what Silas was carrying, and Silas was somewhere on the road between here and Prescott, and there was nothing to do about that except wait and keep working on what was in front of her. 4 days, she said. 4 days. She picked up her pen. Harlan Voss arrived on a Wednesday, which was the day she had scheduled her first full spelling examination for the older children, and which she refused to cancel, because canceling it would have been a signal to Iron Hollow that Voss's arrival had the power to disrupt normal life. And she had decided, without discussing this decision with anyone, because she had not asked anyone's permission for it, that it did not. She heard him arrive from inside the schoolhouse. She heard the horses, the particular quality of the silence that fell over the settlement when unfamiliar authority rode in, and she kept her eyes on the children and her voice level. "Eyes on your slates," she said, to the one boy who had turned toward the window. He turned back. She gave Voss 20 minutes, enough time for the formal pleasantries to run their course, and the real business to begin, before she walked her students through the last section of the examination and dismissed them for the day. She told them to go straight home. Most of them did. Trace Teller did not. She noticed him hanging near the edge of the meeting house when she crossed the settlement, and she made a mental note of it and did not stop him. 15-year-old boys who were paying attention to what happened in their community were not the problem. They were frequently the solution. Voss was inside the meeting house with Calhoun and 4 other men, 2 of the lawyers Calhoun had warned about, the territorial agent, a thin man named Garvey, who had the look of someone who had been told what to think and was committed to thinking it, and Cord Dalloway, who recognized Abigail when she came through the door and whose expression shifted into something she could only describe as amused. Harlan Voss himself was not a large man. She had expected something more physically imposing, given the scale of what he was trying to do. He was perhaps 50, compactly built, with the careful grooming of a man who considers appearance a form of argument. He dressed like money without advertising it. Good wool, good boots, nothing flashy. He looked at her when she came in with the evaluating eyes of a man who categorizes people quickly and acts on those categories. "This is Miss Whitmore," Calhoun said. "She's been assisting with our settlement records." "Miss Whitmore," Voss said, with the tone of a man acknowledging a piece of furniture. He turned back to the map on the table, a map Abigail recognized as a version of the one she'd been working from, except that this one had Voss's boundary markings on it, and looking at it made her jaw tighten. "The issue is straightforward," one of the lawyers was saying. "A man named Freeth, who had the particular energy of a lawyer whose client had already paid him enough to be confident. The original survey of this valley placed the eastern boundary of the Teller parcel here," he pointed. "Subsequent improvements were made outside that boundary, which means the land—" "That survey marker is wrong," Abigail said. Everyone looked at her. Voss's expression did not change. Freeth's did, a slight tightening that was either annoyance or interest. She couldn't tell which. "Miss Whitmore," Calhoun said quietly. "No," she said. "I'm sorry, but if we're having this conversation, we should have it honestly." She moved to the table. The survey marker for the Teller property was established here. She pointed to the position Silas had identified, 20 yards east of where this map shows. The original claim filing, which I have a copy of in this room, reflects that. What this map shows is a revision that does not match the filed record. Freeth looked at her with the expression men sometimes wore when a woman said something technically accurate in a professional setting, the expression that was working out how to dismiss the content without engaging it directly. "And you would know this how?" "I've been reviewing the settlement's documents for the past week," she said, "including cross-referencing them against the territorial survey numbering system. I found 4 properties where the boundaries in your client's versions don't match what was originally filed." She kept her voice flat and factual. "If Agent Garvey would like to see the original claim documents, they're on this table." Garvey, who had been standing slightly behind Voss's shoulder in the manner of a man who hoped not to be called upon, blinked and looked at Voss. Voss looked at Abigail. For the first time since she'd walked in, she had his full attention. "Where did you obtain these documents?" he said. "From the families who hold them," she said. "They're the originals, filed copies." "Filed copies can be amended." "Filed copies can be amended," she agreed, "which is why I've been waiting for a rider to return from Prescott with the originals from the Territorial Land Office." She let a beat pass. "We expect him today or tomorrow." This was not entirely true. She expected Silas today or tomorrow and hoped he was carrying what she needed, but she had no confirmation of either. She was making a claim that was 1/2 accurate and 1/2 necessary. Voss's expression did not change, but something behind it did. Some small recalculation. A man like Voss did not become a man like Voss without knowing when an obstacle had more substance than he'd initially credited. "We'll reconvene when your rider returns," he said, and he said it as though this was his idea, as though he was granting a concession from a position of patience rather than retreating from one he'd wanted to hold. She let him have it. The words didn't matter. What mattered was that he was not getting Agent Garvey to certify anything today. That night was the worst one. Dalloway's men, the 4 who had ridden in with Voss's party, plus 2 she hadn't seen before who appeared to have been waiting at the settlement's edge, made their presence felt without doing anything specifically actionable. They rode the perimeter of Iron Hollow at intervals. They sat their horses near the water source for the loose property for 2 hours without speaking to anyone. One of them stood outside the livery and watched people come and go until Dale Morrow came out and stood in his doorway and watched back. And they stayed there watching each other until the Dalloway man decided he had something else to do. Abigail knew about all of this because Trace Teller reported it to her at 9 in the evening, appearing at Martha's back door with the focused energy of a young man who had found a purpose for his intelligence. "You've been watching them," she said. "Someone should," he said. It was not boastful, just practical. "Did any of them approach the meeting house?" Dalloway walked past it twice, slow. She thought about the documents on the table. "Is anyone in the meeting house right now?" "Gus and my pa," Trey said. "They're talking." "Good." She looked at the boy in her doorway. He was taller than he looked in the classroom, in the dark. Less like a child, more like the beginning of a man. "Trace, go home. You've done well today, but what comes next isn't your job." "What comes next is my home," he said. She held his gaze. He was right, and she knew it, and she also knew that a 15-year-old getting between Dalloway's men and whatever they were planning was a different kind of problem. "Go home," she said, "but tell your father what you told me. Tonight." He went. She sat at the table in the back room for a long while after that, in the dark, not sleeping. Martha came in at some point and set a lamp on the table without speaking and went back to her room, which was exactly the right thing to do and which Abigail appreciated more than she could easily have expressed. She was thinking about Silas, somewhere on the road. She was thinking about 6 documents and 4 discrepancies, and 1 territorial agent who had come here having already made up his mind. She was thinking about 14 children who had showed up to school that morning with their slates and their varying levels of willingness, and who deserved, without any complication of land fraud or corporate pressure, to simply learn things. She was also thinking about Roland Hargrove, who had sat in Cutter's Bend and believed a rumor over the testimony of a woman standing right in front of him. She thought about what kind of life she would have had if she'd arrived and he'd been there and it had gone the way it was supposed to go. She would have been a rancher's wife in a cattle operation she had no part in building. She would have made his house run. She would have been useful in a narrow, defined, permanent way. She would not have been sitting in this room in the dark trying to figure out how to save a community's land from a man with lawyers. She wasn't sure she would have preferred the other version. This thought arrived with a clarity that surprised her, given how tired she was. But Silas wrote in the following morning at 7:15, and she knew it before she saw it because Iron Hollow had a particular silence when nothing was happening and a different particular quality of sound when something was. She came out of Martha's house, and he was dismounting in front of the livery, stiff from the road, his horse looking used and well cared for in the way of Silas's horses. He had a saddlebag over his shoulder that she recognized as new, not the one he'd left with. "Prescott?" she said. "Prescott," he said. He held out the bag. "Land office, original survey filings, certified copies, the lot. The clerk gave me trouble on the 3rd day, wanted authorization paperwork from the settlement." He looked at her with the controlled expression of a man managing frustration. "I told him Everett Calhoun was the settlement authority and that I'd ridden 3 days and would ride 3 more if needed, but I'd like to think we could solve this today." He thought about it and decided he could find the paperwork. "How?" "I sat down in his office and didn't leave." She almost smiled. "That works?" "It works when you've got nothing else." She took the saddlebag. It was heavy. "Voss's people are here, lawyers and a territorial agent." Something shifted in his face. "How long?" "Since yesterday. I bought us time, told them we were expecting documents." She paused. "That was either very smart or very optimistic, depending on when you got back." "I got back," he said. "You did." She looked at him. The road dust, the tiredness he was carrying without complaint, the fact that he'd done exactly what he'd said he would and come back when it mattered. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." He said it without hesitation, the way people say it when they're close enough to find that the distinction isn't worth discussing. "Go eat something," she said. I need an hour with these documents before we can do anything else. And then? And then we go show Harlan Voss what we found. Tem. The meeting was not a comfortable one for anyone. Garvey, the territorial agent, was a man who had arrived expecting to perform a formality and instead found himself between two sets of documentation that did not agree with each other, which was a situation his professional comfort had not budgeted for. He spread the Prescott filings next to Voss's version and spent 15 minutes going back and forth between them with the expression of a man whose headache was becoming structural. Freeth, the lawyer, tried twice to redirect the conversation toward arguments about improvements and adverse possession, which were real legal concepts that Abigail had read enough about to know were the backup plan when the primary plan failed. She let him talk. Calhoun listened. Garvey kept looking at the two maps. Voss sat at the far end of the table and said nothing, and this was actually the thing that worried her most. A man like Voss who stops talking is a man who is switching approaches. The boundary discrepancy is here, she said, to Garvey directly. She kept everyone else in her peripheral vision, but she kept her eyes on the agent, because he was the decision-maker in the room, and she had learned from 6 years of keeping her father's accounts that the person who holds the document holds the conversation. The Prescott filings show the Teller eastern boundary at this marker. Your client's version shows it 20 yards west. They can't both reflect the original survey. She tapped the Prescott document. This is the certified original. This is what was filed. Garvey looked at Freeth. Freeth said carefully, survey corrections are not uncommon. An original filing may contain errors that are subsequently. A correction requires documentation, Abigail said. Where's the correction filing? Silence. Where's the documentation showing that this boundary was surveyed, found to be an error, and corrected? She said. Because if it exists, it would be in the Prescott records, and I went through every document in that saddlebag last night, and it is not there. More silence. Garvey cleared his throat. He had the specific look of a man who had been expecting to do a simple job and had walked into something that was going to follow him home. This would need to be reviewed, he said. By who? Freeth said. By the Territorial Land Office, Garvey said. Properly. This is... He gestured at the spread of documents. This is not something I can certify today. Voss, from the end of the table, said very quietly, Garvey. Garvey looked at him. Something passed between them. Not words. The specific silent exchange of a man who has been paid for a thing and is being reminded of it. Garvey held Voss's gaze for a moment, then looked back at the documents. I can't certify a boundary that contradicts a certified original filing, Garvey said. That's not a position. That's just the law. He said it with the relief of a man who has found, at the last moment, the sentence that lets him walk out of the room with his professional standing intact. Mr. Voss, your lawyers will need to address this through the land office process. Voss stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Abigail with the expression of a man looking at a problem he has not yet solved but has not stopped planning to solve. It was not a defeated look. She noticed that. Miss Whitmore, he said. Mr. Voss, she said. He walked out. Freeth and the other lawyer followed. Garvey lingered a moment, looking at the documents, and then he too left, with the bearing of a man who was going to have a difficult ride back to wherever Voss had found him. The room was quiet. Hector Luce, who had been standing near the door since the meeting began, let out a slow breath. Gus Teller was looking at the documents with an expression she couldn't categorize, something between relief and the residual tension of a man who knows the fight isn't over. Calhoun was looking at her. That was well done, he said. It's not done, she said. He'll go through the land office process. He has money and lawyers, and he's patient. This bought us time, not resolution. Time is what we needed, Calhoun said. Then use it. She began gathering the documents, careful with the Prescott originals, which needed to go somewhere that was not the meeting house table. Every family with a property claim needs to file an updated copy with Prescott. Their own copies, certified here and counterfiled there. If Voss tries to manipulate records again, he has to do it in 2 places simultaneously. She looked at Calhoun. Can you get people to do that? Yes, he said. Soon, she said. Soon, he agreed. She walked out of the meeting house into the midday sun and stood for a moment with the saddlebag against her hip and the settlement around her, the livery, the store, the houses, the schoolhouse at the north end with its new floor and its shutter that closed properly. She was aware that what had just happened in that room was not a victory so much as a delay, and that Voss had resources she did not have and time she did not have, and the particular advantage of someone who can absorb loss and try again. She was also aware that Iron Hollow was still standing. Silas appeared beside her. He had eaten something and changed his shirt and looked approximately like a man who had slept, which she suspected was not entirely true. Garvey left without certifying anything, he said. Yes. Voss didn't take that well. He took it quietly, which is worse, she said. He's not done. No, Silas agreed. He's not. They stood side by side in the sun and looked at the settlement, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that the next move was Voss's, and they did not yet know what shape it would take or how much time they had before it arrived. Inside the schoolhouse at the north end, through the open door, Abigail could see the benches she and Dale had arranged, the blackboard on the wall, the slates in a row. She could see Polly Morrow's small drawing on the corner of the board, a horse, lopsided but determined, that she hadn't had the heart to erase at the end of the previous day's session. Whatever Voss planned next, those children were coming back to that room tomorrow morning. That was the part she could control. She was going to make sure she was there when they arrived. Voss's next move came not from the direction anyone was watching. 3 days after the meeting, a rider arrived from the Calloway ranch. The older woman, Bess, who had spoken plainly at the community meeting about Voss's lawyers, with word that her husband Ned had received a personal visit from Freeth that morning. Not about boundaries this time, about debt. Ned Calloway had a note outstanding with a bank in Tucson, a loan taken out 2 years prior to buy breeding stock, and Freeth had informed him that the note had been purchased by the Consolidated Western Land Company and was now due in full within 15 days. Calhoun heard this and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How many others?" The answer, assembled over the following 24 hours as word moved through the settlement the way bad news always moves faster than good, was 3. 3 families with outstanding banknotes that Voss had quietly acquired. The Calloways, the Mercer family, older couple, southwestern edge of the valley, and a younger rancher named Pete Solis, Sarah Luce's brother-in-law, who had borrowed to rebuild after a flood 2 seasons back, and had been paying down the note steadily, but did not have 15 days' worth of the full balance sitting in any place accessible to him. Abigail sat with this information in the meeting house that evening and thought about it the way she thought about accounting problems. Not with emotion first, but with structure. What was the actual number? What were the actual assets? What was the actual timeline? The actual number, across 3 notes, was substantial. Not impossible, but substantial. More than the settlement could raise in 15 days through any ordinary means. He doesn't need everyone to fold, Silas said. He was sitting across from her, and Calhoun was at the end of the table, and Gus and Dale were against the wall, and Hector Luz had his hat in his hands and was turning it in a slow circle. He just needs the Calloways or the Solises to have to sell. One property breaks the boundary of the valley's western range. After that, he can apply pressure from 2 sides instead of 1. Pete Solis's land, Hector said. He was not asking. Pete's land is the western access to the valley water, Silas said. Voss gets that. He controls the water. He controls the water. The rest of the properties are worth half what they are now. Abigail looked at the map. She had been looking at it for weeks now, and its geography had become as familiar to her as the lines of her own palm. She could see exactly what Silas was describing. The valley shaped like a cupped hand, the Solis property at the heel of it, the water running from north to south through the land Pete Solis had borrowed money to rebuild. "How much does Pete owe?" she said. Hector told her. She wrote it down. "And the Calloways?" Calhoun told her. She wrote that down too. "And the Mercers are the smallest note," she said. "If we address Pete and the Calloways, the Mercers can be handled." "Address them how?" Dale said. He said it without challenge, just the honest question of a man who wanted to know if there was a plan or if they were all just sitting in a room together feeling bad about the situation. "The settlement pooling resources," Abigail said. Every family that has anything liquid contributes what they can toward the two largest notes. We calculate the gap, and then we figure out how to close it. People don't have that kind of cash sitting around, Gus said. No, she agreed. But some people have livestock they can sell. Some people have materials. Some people have labor they can trade for credit with suppliers who might extend terms. She looked at him. This is not a clean solution. It's going to be uncomfortable, and people are going to give up things they'd rather keep. But the alternative is Pete Solis losing his land and Voss having the valley's water. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Hector Luce set his hat on the table. Tell me what number we need from each family, he said. I'll go talk to people tonight. Quote, what happened over the following 9 days was not heroic in the way that stories sometimes make things sound. It was grinding and unglamorous, and it involved a lot of conversations that did not go easily, and at least 2 that Abigail heard about secondhand that came close to breaking down entirely before someone said the right thing. Gus Teller contributed cash from the store's operating reserve, which he did not announce, and which Abigail found out about only when she was reconciling the contribution list. When she mentioned it to him, he told her he wasn't looking for recognition and she should put it in the column and move on. Dale Morrow sold 2 horses he'd been planning to keep. He didn't mention this to Martha until after the sale was done, and Martha came to find Abigail the following morning with a particular expression on her face, not upset exactly, but processing, and said, he didn't tell me he was going to do it. Are you angry? Abigail said. Martha thought about it honestly. No, she said. I think I'm just... We've been here 11 years, and I didn't know he'd do that without talking to me first. Didn't know he felt that strongly about staying. People surprise you, Abigail said. They do, Martha said. She stood in the schoolhouse doorway for a moment, watching the children file in. He never finished the schoolhouse that was going to be for our daughter. Couldn't bring himself to. She paused. He finished yours. Abigail didn't say anything to that. She put her hand briefly on Martha's arm and then turned back to the room, because the children were settling onto the benches and Polly Morrow was in the front row with her slate ready and her serious face pointed forward, waiting. The Luce family contributed the most, Hector and his 2 sons, who between them had a cattle operation that was the largest remaining in the valley, organized a quick sale of 20 head at a price slightly below market, and put the proceeds toward the note fund without being asked twice. Sarah appeared at the schoolhouse door on the 4th day with a covered dish, and the information that the sale had gone through, delivered in the matter-of-fact tone she used for everything, as though feeding people and saving their land were tasks of equivalent size. On the 8th day, they were still short, not by much. Enough to matter. It was Trace Teller who solved it, which she had not anticipated and which she thought about for a long time afterward. He appeared at the meeting house door that evening while she was going over the numbers for the 4th time, hoping the math had changed since the last time she'd looked at it. She heard him come in and glanced up and started to say he should be home, and he held out a leather pouch. What is this? She said. It's $112, he said. It's everything I've saved since I was 8 years old. She stared at him. My mother's people gave me money when we left New Mexico, he said. I've been adding to it. Odd jobs. I didn't... He stopped. He was 15 and he was trying very hard to sound like this was a practical decision and not an emotional one, and he was not entirely succeeding. My pa doesn't know about it. I'm telling you first. Trace, she said. It's enough to close the gap, he said. I looked at the numbers on the board yesterday. She had been putting the running total on the schoolhouse blackboard each morning, partly to track it, partly because she had a suspicion that children who watched the number move would bring it home to their parents and it would do a kind of quiet work she couldn't do through any direct conversation. She had not anticipated that one of the children would decide to close the gap himself. You've been saving that for years, she said. I know. He set the pouch on the table. But if Voss gets Pete's land, there's not going to be a lot of point to what I've been saving for. He looked at her with the directness of a boy who has made an adult decision and is now stuck with having made it. Can you use it or not? She looked at the pouch. She looked at him. I can use it, she said. And Trace, don't tell my pa where it came from, he said. Just tell him it was a community contribution. She looked at him for a long moment. I'll tell him it came from someone in the settlement who believed in Iron Hollow, she said. That's true. He nodded once with the contained satisfaction of someone who had done a thing they needed to do and was going to carry it quietly. He left. She sat with the pouch in her hands and the running total on the imaginary blackboard in her mind, and the gap was closed, and she felt something that was not triumph but was adjacent to it, the feeling of a thing holding together that had been in real danger of not. The notes were paid on the 13th day. Calhoun handled the transaction in Prescott through a lawyer he trusted, a woman named Frances Dodd, who had made it her life's work to be the kind of lawyer that people like Voss didn't expect to encounter. Frances Dodd received the funds, settled all 3 notes simultaneously, and sent Freeth a letter that Calhoun read aloud at the community meeting and which produced from Hector Luce the first genuine laugh she had heard in 2 weeks. They had 1 day to spare on Voss's 15-day deadline, but Voss did not accept this quietly. 2 nights after the notes were settled, Dalloway's men came back, not to talk this time. They came after midnight, 4 of them on horses with their faces covered, and what they did was methodical and deliberate. They cut the fence line on the north pasture of the Luce property, drove 30 head of Hector's cattle out through the gap, and then collapsed a section of the water channel that fed from the creek to the Solis land. By the time anyone knew what had happened, it was 4 in the morning, and by the time it was light enough to track, the cattle were scattered across 3 miles of open range, and the channel damage had let enough water divert that it would take 2 days of work to repair. Abigail was at the Solis property by 5:30 in the thin early light, standing at the broken channel with Pete Solis and Silas and Hector, looking at what had been done. The damage was specific and knowledgeable. Whoever had done it had understood exactly where to break the channel to cause maximum downstream impact with minimum visible effort. This wasn't Dalloway's boys deciding to be difficult on their own, Silas said. He was crouched at the break point, looking at it. Someone told them exactly where to hit. Voss, Pete said. Voss or someone who knows this land, Silas said. He stood. Someone who's been out here, walking this property, looking at the infrastructure. He looked at the break. Recently. Abigail thought about the past 3 weeks, about every time Dalloway's men had ridden through the settlement, about Voss's own visit and where he had walked and what he had looked at. Garvey, she said. Silas looked at her. The territorial agent, she said. He was here. He walked the settlement with Voss before the meeting. He would have seen this channel. Garvey's a land agent, Hector said. He does surveys. Yes, Abigail said. He does. The implications settled over them. Silas's jaw tightened. Pete Solis looked at the broken channel with the expression of a man deciding how angry he was going to let himself be, which was a decision she recognized. The frontier version of counting to 10. All right, Silas said. We fix the channel first. Then we figure out what to do about Garvey. There's not much to do about Garvey, Hector said. He's a territorial official. He's a territorial official who may have provided information used to commit property damage, Abigail said. That's not a career-neutral position to be in. She looked at the channel. Can we document the damage? How? Pete said. Describe it, measure it, have witnesses sign a statement before we repair it. She looked at Silas. Same for the fence line and the cattle scatter. We document everything before we touch it. You want a paper record, Silas said. I want a paper record, she said. If this ever gets in front of a judge, and I think we should be trying to make sure it does, we need a paper record. Ashim. The documentation took the better part of the morning. It was not comfortable work. Measuring a broken water channel in the growing heat, getting statements from the Solis family and the Luce sons and Dale Morrow, who had come out to help with the cattle and ended up serving as a witness to damage that was not on his property and did not directly affect him, which she noted and appreciated without saying so. Silas drafted the statements. His handwriting was slow and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write in prison and had made it careful and permanent. He asked exact questions and wrote exact answers and did not editorialize. When it was done, she read through everything and found only one place where the language was vague, and she changed it, and he read the change and nodded. You should have been a lawyer, he said. I should have been a lot of things, she said. He looked at her briefly. You're this, he said, which was such a direct and unornamented thing to say that she didn't have an immediate answer for it, and he moved on before she had to find one. By early afternoon, the cattle were mostly gathered. They'd lost 3 that couldn't be found in the available time, which Pete would have to absorb. And the channel was repaired and the documentation was signed and witnessed and in Abigail's keeping. And then Dalloway himself rode in. He came alone this time, which was its own kind of statement. A man confident enough in the situation that he didn't need backup for what he was about to say. He found the group of them at the Solis property, and he looked at the repaired channel and the gathered cattle and the people standing in the yard, and he said, with the easy tone of a man delivering a weather forecast, Mr. Voss has asked me to inform you that the land office process on the boundary dispute is moving forward. He expects a ruling within 60 days. We'll be waiting, Calhoun said. He also wanted me to say, and here Dalloway looked specifically at Abigail, which was a choice she registered, that whatever documentation has been assembled here is amateur work and won't hold up to proper legal scrutiny. The yard was quiet for a moment. Abigail said, Tell Mr. Voss that the documentation has been signed by 6 witnesses, 2 of whom are property owners of record in this valley, and that copies have been made. She paused. And that I'd like him to tell me, if he can, where Agent Garvey was on the night of the 14th, because I'm going to be asking that question to several people over the next few weeks, and I'd like to know if his answer is consistent. Dalloway's ease did not leave him entirely, but something behind it shifted. The specific shift of a man who has been handed information he did not expect and is now recalculating what it means. I'll pass that along, he said. He rode out. Hector Luce watched him go. Garvey, he said to no one in particular. You think it'll stick? I think it'll worry someone, Abigail said. Sometimes that's enough. It was enough. Not immediately and not cleanly. Nothing was clean, but the thread she'd pulled began to unravel in the right direction. Francis Dodd, once given the documented damage reports and the timeline connecting Garvey's visit with the specific nature of the infrastructure attack, filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office about the conduct of their agent. The complaint did not result in Garvey's arrest, or even, as far as anyone in Iron Hollow ever confirmed, in his formal censure. What it resulted in was Garvey refusing to participate in any further proceedings related to the Iron Hollow boundary dispute. He sent a letter to that effect. Francis Dodd told Calhoun that in her professional assessment, a man who withdraws from a proceeding rather than defend his conduct in it has communicated something meaningful about his conduct. Without Garvey, Voss's land office strategy required a different agent, and a different agent required time to be persuaded and positioned. And time was the one thing that Voss had believed he had more of than the settlers. It turned out not to be as simple as that. While Voss was repositioning, Francis Dodd filed the counter-documentation, the Prescott originals, the settlement statements, the witness accounts of the property damage, with the Territorial Land Office as a formal counterclaim to the boundary dispute. She was strategic about the timing, filing on a day when a different official than the one Voss's lawyers preferred was on duty. The counterclaim was accepted and assigned a case number. Once it had a case number, it was real in the way that legal processes become real. Harder to make disappear quietly. Harder to resolve through private pressure. Visible to anyone who cared to look at the territorial record. Calhoun told Abigail about the case number on a Thursday morning, walking past the schoolhouse where she was setting up the day's work on the blackboard. It's not over, she said. No, he agreed, but it's on record. Voss can't move without the record seeing it. She nodded and went back to the blackboard. Through the open door, she could hear the children arriving. The sound of feet on the new floor, the particular voices. Polly Morrow asking someone what a word meant, Trace Teller telling her, impatiently but accurately. The thing that finally broke Voss's position did not come from the legal process. It came from a letter. Francis Dodd had, in the course of researching the Consolidated Western Land Company's history for the counterclaim, found that Iron Hollow was not the first settlement Voss had tried this on. There was a valley in New Mexico, 8 years prior, and before that a settlement in Nevada. In both cases, the pattern was the same: boundary manipulation, debt acquisition, infrastructure damage, and then, after the settlers broke, a land sale to Eastern investors at prices that suggested the valley's water and grazing rights had been undervalued for the purpose of the original purchase. The New Mexico case had never gone anywhere legally, but there were settlers from it who had dispersed, some to Colorado, some to Arizona, some to Texas. And one of them had written a letter to a newspaper in Santa Fe at the time, which the newspaper had run, and which Frances Dodd had located in the paper's archived records. She sent a copy to Calhoun. Calhoun gave it to Abigail. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she sat for a while thinking about what a piece of paper from 8 years ago was worth, and who might care about it. "There's a man named Allard," she said to Silas the same evening. "Territorial Attorney General's office. Calhoun mentioned him when we were talking about the Marshall situation. Said Allard was the one honest person in the Prescott government apparatus who wasn't connected to land development interests." "Calhoun knows him?" Silas said. "They served together, I think, before Calhoun came out here." She held up the letter. "This establishes a pattern, not just a dispute, a method. That's different." Silas looked at the letter. "You want to send it to Allard?" "I want to send him the letter, the counterclaim documentation, the witness statements about the property damage, and the timeline connecting Garvey's survey visit with the infrastructure attack." She set the letter down. "Frances Dodd can send it. She has standing. I don't." "What do you think Allard does with it?" "I don't know," she said. "I think there's a chance he looks at a land company that's done this in 3 territories and decides that's the kind of pattern a territorial attorney general ought to have an opinion about." She looked at Silas. "Or he does nothing, and we're back where we were. But sending it costs us nothing." He nodded. "All right." She wrote out what she thought the accompanying letter should say, and gave it to Calhoun, who agreed with the strategy and sent word to Frances Dodd by return rider that same day. Allard's response came 22 days later. Not to Calhoun, to Voss. A formal letter from the Territorial Attorney General's office informing the Consolidated Western Land Company that its land acquisition practices in the Arizona Territory were under review pending examination of documentation submitted by legal counsel representing the Iron Hollow settlement, and that no boundary proceedings currently underway in relation to Iron Hollow parcels were to be concluded until the review was complete. Calhoun read it aloud at the community meeting and then set it down on the table and didn't say anything because he didn't need to. The room was not quiet the way rooms are when something solemn has happened. It was quiet the way rooms are when people are trying to hold on to something that they're afraid to move too fast or say too loud in case it changes. Then Hector Luz said, "Well," and Gus Teller said, "Well," in a different tone. And Sarah Luce put her hand over her mouth, and her husband put his arm around her and didn't say anything at all. Pete Solis stood at the back of the room with his arms at his sides and his face doing something complicated that Abigail looked away from because it was private. Martha Morrow was next to Abigail, and she put her hand over Abigail's on the table, briefly, and then took it back and straightened up with the bearing of a woman who has lived through enough things that she has learned to receive good news with the same steadiness she brings to bad. Voss did not fold immediately. He spent 3 weeks having his lawyers draft responses and counterarguments and requests for procedural delays. And Frances Dodd countered each one with the specific precision of a woman who had been doing this for 30 years, and found that she had exactly as much patience for it as the situation required, and not one moment more. But the Attorney General's review put a ceiling on what Voss could accomplish through the land office process, and without that avenue moving forward on his timeline, the financial logic of the operation shifted. The Consolidated Western Land Company had been counting on a fast acquisition and a fast sale to Eastern investors. The longer it dragged out, the less profitable it became. By the time Calhoun received a second letter from Frances Dodd, informing him that Voss's lawyers had requested a meeting to discuss a withdrawal of the boundary claims in exchange for the settlement dropping its formal complaint, it was late November, and the schoolhouse had been running for 3 months, and Polly Morrow had learned to read. Not all the way. Not fluently, but she could read the sentences on the blackboard without help, which she demonstrated one morning by reading aloud, in a small and serious voice, the arithmetic problem Abigail had written at the start of class. and then looking up with an expression that suggested she was not surprised to have accomplished this, but was pleased to have it confirmed. Abigail looked at that child's face and felt something that she did not try to name because naming it would make it smaller than it was. It. The settlement meeting at which Calhoun presented Voss's withdrawal offer was not straightforward. There were people who wanted to push further, who wanted the complaint maintained, who wanted Voss held accountable in some more permanent way for the property damage, for the debt manipulation, for 3 months of a community living under the specific low-grade terror of not knowing if they would still have their land next season. Abigail understood this impulse. She shared it. But she also sat through Francis Dodd's assessment, delivered by letter and read aloud by Calhoun, which was plain. The Attorney General's review was ongoing but not certain. Voss had enough resources to fight a formal complaint for years, and the settlement's most reliable path to security was land that was legally documented, counterfiled, and no longer in active dispute. A withdrawal of the boundary claims, combined with the existing counter-documentation, gave Iron Hollow a legal position that would be substantially harder to attack in the future. "She's saying take the offer," Gus said. "She's saying consider it carefully," Calhoun said. "She's saying take the offer," Gus said again, not unkindly. The vote was not unanimous. 2 families voted against. Everyone else voted to accept the withdrawal terms and end the dispute. Voss's boundary claims were formally withdrawn in December. The settlement's counter-documentation remained on record. The Attorney General's review of the Consolidated Western Land Company continued for another 6 months before concluding with findings that, while falling short of criminal charges, resulted in 2 of Voss's lawyers being subject to professional review and Garvey's quiet transfer to a desk position in Prescott from which he never emerged. Dalloway was not heard from again in the Maricopa Highlands, which could have meant many things and which no one in Iron Hollow spent much time worrying about. On the evening after the withdrawal documents were signed and returned to Francis Dodd's office, Abigail sat on the step outside Martha's house and looked at Iron Hollow in the winter dark. The lit windows, the smoke, the sound of someone's cattle in the north pasture, and felt the particular exhaustion of a person who has been pushing against something hard for a long time and has just felt it give way. Silas sat down on the step beside her. He did not ask how she was. She had noticed a fairly reliable instinct for when questions were helpful and when presence was the thing. After a while, she said, "Voss will do this somewhere else." "Probably," he said. "Someone else's valley." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "That bothers me." "I know it does." He was looking at the lit windows of the settlement. "But you can't fix everything. You fix this." She thought about whether that was enough. She thought about the New Mexico Valley 8 years ago and whoever had lived there and lost it. She thought about the fact that she had been in Iron Hollow for 3 months and could not now imagine having not come here, which was a strange thought for a woman who had arrived with no intention of staying. "Silas," she said. "Yeah." "Why did you come to Cutter's Bend to find me?" She'd been turning this over for weeks. "Calhoun sent you, I know, but you didn't have to take the job." He was quiet for a moment in the specific way she had come to recognize. Not evasion, just honesty that needed a moment to find its shape. "Calhoun told me what had happened to you," he said. "A woman who'd sold everything she had, came all the way out here on someone's word, and got a note instead of a husband." He paused. "I know what it is to have people decide who you are before they've looked at you. Figured if you were half as capable as Patience Aldrich said you were, you deserved better than sitting on a platform in Cutter's Bend." She looked at him. He was looking at the settlement, not at her. "Half as capable," she said. The near smile. "Turns out she undersold it some." She laughed. The real kind, the kind that came without planning it. He looked at her then, and there was something in his face that was not guarded at all, which was unusual enough that she held his gaze for a moment longer than she might have. She looked back at the settlement. He looked back at the settlement. "Iron Hollow's going to be all right," she said. "It is," he said. They sat on the step in the cold December air, and the windows stayed lit, and the cattle were quiet in the pasture, and Iron Hollow existed around them, imperfect, scarred from the past months, stubbornly intact. Winter in the Maricopa Highlands was not gentle. Abigail had not expected it to be. She had grown up with Missouri winters, which were wet and gray and had a particular talent for making everything feel provisional. And she had imagined the Arizona territory would be different, drier, harder, the cold coming from altitude rather than moisture. She had been right about the dryness and wrong about the hardness. The cold that settled into Iron Hollow in January had a clarity to it that Missouri winters never did, a cleanness in the air that made distances look shorter than they were, and sounds carry further than you expected. She woke some mornings to frost on the inside of the sticking window, and her own breath visible in the back room at Martha's house, and she lay still for a moment taking inventory of the day ahead before she got up, which was a habit she'd had since childhood and which the frontier had made more purposeful. The schoolhouse had a stove now. Dale had installed it in November, a cast iron box stove that had been sitting in parts in the back of Gus's store for 2 years because the man who'd ordered it had left Iron Hollow before it arrived. It heated the room adequately if you arrived early and fed it steadily, and Trace Teller had appointed himself the person responsible for both of these things without being asked, which was the kind of development that told you something about what a classroom could do to a 15-year-old boy who'd previously thought himself above it. She arrived each morning to find the stove already lit. She never mentioned it, and neither did he. It was one of those arrangements that worked precisely because no one formalized it. The children came even in the cold. This was the thing that surprised her most about Iron Hollow. Not the resilience of the adults, which she had come to expect, but the specific tenacity of the children, who appeared in the schoolhouse doorway in wool coats and scarves and wet boots, and took their places on the benches with a seriousness that she had stopped finding remarkable only because she'd seen it every day for 4 months. They wanted this. They had wanted it before she arrived, in the unfocused way that people want things they can't yet name, and now they wanted it specifically, each of them building something in their own heads that was distinctly theirs. Polly Morrow was reading short sentences on her own by February, and the look on her face when she did it, not the look she showed anyone, the private one, the one she had when she didn't know Abigail was watching, was something Abigail filed away in the part of herself that she returned to when the work was difficult. It was in February that the letter arrived from St. Louis. She almost didn't recognize the handwriting. It had been 7 months, and she had not written home. And she had told herself this was because she had no fixed address worth communicating, and not because she was afraid of what she'd find in a reply. Both of these things were partially true. The letter was from her sister Clara, 3 pages in Clara's cramped practical script, and it said most of what Abigail had expected it to say. Gerald was angry. Gerald had told people that Abigail had gone west and failed, which was almost true in the ways that made it sting, and not true in the ways that mattered. Clara said she didn't know exactly what Gerald had written to Roland Hargrove, but that she had found a draft of a letter in Gerald's desk 2 months after Abigail left. She didn't say why she'd been looking through his desk, and Abigail didn't need her to, and that the draft had contained language about Abigail's character that Clara described, with unusual precision, as things a man invents about a woman when he wants her gone and needs a reason. Abigail read this paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter and set it on the shelf above her 3 books, and looked at it for a while. She had known from the morning on the Cutter's Bend platform that Gerald had done something deliberate. Having it confirmed in writing did not change anything material about her situation. It did not give her back the months between that platform and this room, and it did not alter the fact that she was here now, which she had stopped regretting some time ago. What it did was close something. A door she'd been standing next to without realizing she was waiting for it to close. She wrote back to Clara that same evening. She told her the outline of what had happened: the settlement, the land dispute, the school, Iron Hollow. She told her she was well. She did not tell her to leave Gerald, because Clara had not asked for that advice and would not have welcomed it, and because some things were not Abigail's to decide for other people. She told her that if she ever wanted to leave, Iron Hollow was a real place with real families and a school that needed a second teacher, and that the offer would stand. She sealed the letter and gave it to the next rider going toward Prescott and did not expect Clara to come, and was at peace with that. The question of Silas had been developing in the way that slow things develop, not through dramatic events but through the accumulation of ordinary ones, The specific gravity of two people who have been through difficult things together and have gotten used to each other's presence in a way that is different from simply being accustomed to someone. She noticed things about him that she'd been noticing for months and had been filing under the category of observation rather than anything more complicated. The way he checked the settlement's perimeter every evening without announcing it, a habit left over from the months of Voss's pressure that he hadn't dropped even after the withdrawal, because some vigilances become structural. The way he spoke to Polly Morrow, who had decided he was trustworthy on some basis that children use and that adults cannot fully access. Short sentences, no condescension, complete attention for the duration of the exchange. The way he disagreed with Calhoun when he thought Calhoun was wrong, directly and without theater, and then did what Calhoun decided anyway, because he understood the difference between being heard and being in charge. The way he had told her, on that step in December, that she deserved better than a platform in Cutter's Bend. Not as a declaration, but as a statement of fact. The way he stated most things, and which she found herself returning to more often than was probably useful. It was Sarah Luz who said the thing out loud that everyone else in Iron Hollow had apparently been thinking for some time. She appeared at the schoolhouse door in late February with the usual covered dish. Sarah had made feeding Abigail a personal project that Abigail had accepted on the grounds that resisting it took more energy than Sarah had and would not succeed, and sat on the new floor with her back against the wall while Abigail tidied the slates for the following day, and said, without preamble, "When are you and Silas going to stop pretending you're just working together?" Abigail did not immediately respond to this. "I'm not asking to be nosy," Sarah said. "I'm asking because half the settlement has an opinion about it, and I thought it was better you hear it from me than from Gus Teller." "Gus Teller has an opinion about this?" "Gus Teller has an opinion about everything." Sarah pulled her shawl tighter. "He thinks Silas is going to build a horse operation east of here, and that you're going to be the one who finally makes him believe he deserves to." Abigail set down the slates. She sat on the bench closest to the stove. "That's a lot for Gus to have worked out." "He pays more attention than he looks like he does." Abigail looked at the blackboard. The day's last problem still chalked there, a long division exercise she'd written for Trace. "I don't know what Silas thinks," she said. "Yes, you do," Sarah said, without cruelty. "Just as a fact." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "I came here on someone's word once before," she said. "It didn't go well." "That was a contract," Sarah said. "A stranger deciding he wanted a wife the way he'd order a supply of grain. You know that's not the same thing." "I know it's not the same thing." "But you're still scared." She didn't deny it. Being scared was not a character failure. It was the appropriate response to having gotten things badly wrong before. "Yes," she said. Sarah nodded. She was quiet for a moment in the companionable way she had, the way of someone who does not feel that silence requires filling. "My husband's family didn't want him to marry me," she said. "I was not what they imagined for him. Too Mexican, too loud, not enough of whatever they'd pictured." She looked at the stove. "Hector was the one who came to me. He said he was not asking me to trust his family. He was asking me to trust him." She paused. "It's been 14 years. Abigail looked at her. "I'm not telling you what to do," Sarah said. "I'm telling you that the person asking matters more than the category of the question." She left the covered dish and went home, and Abigail sat in the cooling schoolhouse with the stove ticking down and thought about what Sarah had said, and thought about Silas, and thought about the difference between being afraid of being hurt and being wise enough to be careful, and how those two things could look identical from the outside and felt different from the inside, only if you were honest about which one was operating. She found him the following evening at the East Pasture fence, doing work that did not urgently need doing, which she recognized as the frontier equivalent of pacing. "Sarah Luz talked to you," he said, before she'd said anything. He was looking at the fence post he was reinforcing rather than at her. "She did," Abigail said. "She talked to me first," he said. "Last week." Abigail absorbed this. "What did she say to you?" "That you weren't the kind of woman who needed things handled carefully." He paused. "That you'd rather someone just said the thing directly." "That's accurate," she said. He set down the post driver and turned to look at her, and the evening light was the particular winter gold that made everything look considered and deliberate. He had the expression she associated with him in moments of genuine seriousness. Not closed, but careful, the way a person looks when they are trying to say something accurately and know the words matter. "I've got a piece of land east of here," he said. "Calhoun helped me file for it 2 years ago. 40 acres, good grass, water from the eastern branch of the creek." He stopped. "I've been putting off building on it because—" He looked at the fence. "Because the version of it I kept imagining had more than one person in it, and I couldn't figure out if I had any right to imagine that." She waited. "I spent 2 years in a territorial prison," he said. "I've told you that. What I didn't tell you is that I spent the next 4 years after that being very careful not to want things I might not deserve to have. That gets to be a habit." He looked at her. "And then you showed up on a platform in Cutter's Bend, and I rode you across 3 days of difficult country, and you argued with me about carrying your own trunk and worked through the night on someone else's land records, and told Harlan Voss's lawyer that a document was a document in front of 6 people who hadn't decided yet whether to trust you." He paused, and the habit stopped making as much sense. Abigail looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what Sarah had said, that the person asking matters more than the category of the question. She thought about the difference between Roland Hargrove, who had made a decision about her without looking at her face, and this man who had looked at her and kept looking, with the steady eyes of someone who intended to see accurately. "I came here expecting to belong to someone's life," she said, "to fit into a space that already existed, to be the thing that completed a picture someone else had drawn." She looked at the pasture. "I don't want that anymore. I want to build something. I want the building to be mine as much as anyone else's." "I know that," he said. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I have opinions about most things, and I'm usually right, and I'm aware that's not a comfortable combination." Something moved in his face that was more than the near smile she'd gotten used to. It was the full version, the one she'd seen maybe 3 times in 7 months, and it changed his face considerably. "I noticed that about you on the first day," he said, "and you're not—" She stopped. "You're not entirely an easy man yourself." "No," he agreed. "I'm not." They stood at the fence in the winter evening, and the cattle were somewhere in the middle distance, and Iron Hollow was at their backs. And she thought that the difference between this moment and a train platform in Cutter's Bend 7 months ago was not just circumstance. It was the difference between being assigned a life and choosing one. "Build your house," she said. "I'll tell you when it's big enough." He looked at her for a moment. "That's the most Abigail Whitmore thing anyone has ever said to me," he said. "I'm aware," she said. She walked back toward the settlement. She was smiling, which she did not try to stop because there was no one on the path who needed her to be composed about it. Spring came to Iron Hollow with the specific insistence of things that have been waiting. The grass came up green in the valley floor in March, and the creek ran fuller than it had in years. A wet winter, people said, was a good sign, though Abigail had been in Iron Hollow long enough to know that people said that about wet winters and dry winters equally, because what the frontier required was optimism applied selectively to whatever the weather was doing. The schoolhouse in March held 17 children. 3 families had arrived in February. A couple from Colorado with 5 children, a widow named Harriet Bain with 2 boys, and a young family from Texas whose youngest was 4 and too small for school, but who appeared anyway and sat next to Polly Morrow and was tolerated there with the benevolent authority of a 6-year-old who has been the smallest person in a room and remembers what it was like. Abigail had written to 2 places in the spring about acquiring more books. One of them, a women's charitable organization in San Francisco that she'd found mentioned in a back issue of a newspaper Gus kept in the store, had responded with a crate of 37 volumes that arrived in April on the supply wagon from Prescott, packed in straw, and which she had unpacked in the schoolhouse alone because she'd wanted to see them first herself, running her hands across the spines with a feeling she could not have dignified with language, but which had everything to do with the fact that these children were going to read these books, and those books were going to put things in their heads that no amount of frontier hardship could take back out. Trace Teller, who was 16 now and beginning to have the serious focus of someone who knows what he's working toward, had taken to staying after school twice a week for what Abigail was privately calling advanced sessions and publicly calling extra arithmetic. He was working through material 2 grade levels beyond anyone else in the room. She had begun writing to Calhoun's contacts in Prescott about the possibility of a formal secondary school program. There was nothing like it within 4 days' ride, and there were now enough children in the valley who would need it. Gus Teller, when she mentioned this to him at the store one afternoon in April, said nothing for a long moment and then said, "How much would that cost?" "More than we have," she said. "But less than you'd think." "Write up what you need," he said. "I'll look at it." She wrote it up. He looked at it. He made 2 changes, which were both improvements, and then he gave it to Calhoun, and Calhoun began the correspondence with Prescott. And by summer there was a formal proposal in front of the Territorial Education Office that had the settlement's full backing and Gus Teller's signature prominently on it, which she suspected carried more weight with certain people than anything else on the document. Silas began building in April. He had spent the winter drawing plans. She knew this because he showed them to her one evening in March, spreading a sheet of paper on the meeting house table with the focused look of a man who has been thinking about something for a long time and wants a second opinion. And she had looked at the plans and made 3 suggestions, 2 of which he incorporated immediately, and 1 of which he argued about for 20 minutes before incorporating as well. The house was going up east of the settlement, as he'd said, on the 40 acres with the creek water. Dale Morrow helped with the framing. Hector Luce's sons helped with the heavier work on 2 weekends in late April. Pete Solis, who had a gift for stonework that emerged from somewhere in his family's history, built the fireplace foundation without being asked and refused payment, and told Silas that some things were between neighbors and not transactions. Abigail went to see it on a Sunday in May, when the frame was up and the walls were beginning to take shape. She walked the interior, no floors yet, no roof, just the skeleton of it, and stood in what would be the main room and looked at the proportions. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. Silas was watching her from the doorway. "You told me to build it big enough." She looked at the space. She thought about what Martha had said about Dale not telling her about the horses until after. The way people sometimes made decisions about belonging before they'd found the words for it. She thought about what Sarah had said about the person asking. She thought about 17 children and 37 books, and a proposal in front of the Territorial Education Office, and a community that had been tested and had held. "There's a room here that would make a good study," she said, "if someone needed one." "I was thinking that too," he said. She turned and looked at him in the doorway, and the Maylight was behind him, and the air smelled of cut lumber and grass, and she thought, this is the moment. Not a dramatic moment, not the kind that announces itself. Just a door that's been unlocked for a while, and now someone's opening it. "Silas," she said. "Yeah." "Ask me properly," she said. "I've had a contract before. I want a question this time." He came off the doorframe. He walked into the room that would be the main room, on the packed earth that would eventually be a floor, and he stood in front of her with his hat in his hand. She had once thought this a habit he performed without thinking, and had since revised this view because she had come to believe that Silas Boone almost never did anything without thinking about it. "I know you didn't come here looking for this," he said. "I know you came here because you had no other options, and you made something out of that, and now you have options. Real ones. So I'm not asking you because you need something from me." He stopped. "I'm asking you because when I think about that house being finished and what it's supposed to be, you're the only version of it that makes sense to me." He held her gaze. "Abigail, will you marry me?" It was not a long speech. It was not elaborate. It was the most direct thing she had ever been offered by another person, stripped of every convenience and every contract and every practical framing, and it arrived with the weight of something that meant exactly what it said. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath, a small one, the kind that told her he had been less certain than he'd appeared, which she found more honest and therefore more reassuring than certainty would have been. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. He put his hat back on. She looked at the room that would be her study. Outside, through the open door frame, the valley was green and wide, and the creek made its sound in the middle distance. An iron hollow was visible on the western edge of the view. The meeting house, the store, the schoolhouse roof. They married in June, which was not planned so much as arrived at. The date settled itself the way things settle in a place where people have more sense than ceremony. Calhoun officiated, which was a capacity he held as a justice of the peace, a fact he had mentioned once and not again because he was not a man who advertised functions. The ceremony was in the valley, not the meeting house, because it was June, and the valley was at its best in June, and there was no reason to be indoors. Martha Morrow cried, which she would have denied if asked, and Dale stood beside her with his large hands folded, and his expression the expression of a man who is deeply contented with the way things have worked out, and does not feel the need to announce it. Sarah Luce brought food, obviously. Enough food for everyone in Iron Hollow twice over, because Sarah's response to any significant event was to ensure that no one present could claim to be hungry. Gus Teller shook Silas's hand with the grip of a man communicating something he could not be persuaded to say directly, and shook Abigail's hand too, which she suspected was not something he did often, and which she accepted with the gravity it deserved. Trace Teller stood in the back with his younger siblings and watched the whole thing with the look of a young man who is calibrating something in his understanding of how the world works and finding the calibration satisfactory. Polly Morrow had picked wildflowers that morning and appeared with them in a bunch that had seen better moments by the time the ceremony began, slightly wilted and held in a determined small fist, and she gave them to Abigail before anyone could tell her whether this was appropriate or not, which was exactly right. Hector Luz said something in Spanish at the end of the ceremony that Abigail didn't catch all of. She asked Sarah later what it was. Sarah smiled. "He said the valley is luckier than it knows," she said. "Wolves." The house was finished in August, and moving in was not the smooth and graceful process that the phrase implies. There was a week of things in the wrong places, and a disagreement about where the table should go that lasted 2 days and was resolved in Abigail's favor on the grounds, which Silas accepted without much argument, that she spent more hours at a table than he did, and therefore had a more developed opinion about table placement. There was a morning where the stove smoked badly because the chimney draw was wrong, and Dale came out and fixed it, and told Silas he should have consulted him on the chimney height, which was true, and Silas acknowledged this without excessive humility and without irritation, which was one of the things she had come to value about him. He received being wrong with the same steadiness he brought to everything else. The study was hers. It had the shelf she'd asked for, and the window faced east, and in the mornings the light came in at the angle that made reading easy. Her books were on the shelf. More books now, the original 3 from her trunk plus what had accumulated since. There was a desk that Silas had made himself, which was not perfectly level, but was solid and hers, and she sat at it in the early mornings before school and worked on the secondary school proposal and her correspondence, and in the evening sometimes, letters to the Territorial Education Office that Francis Dodd had taught her to write in the particular language that government offices respond to. She was not always patient. She was not always easy. There were evenings when the accumulated weight of the day, the children, the correspondence, the ongoing low-level work of being someone that a community relies on, settled on her in a way that made her short, and she knew she was being short and couldn't immediately fix it. Silas had his own difficult evenings, the ones where something in him went quiet in a way that was not peaceful but distant, and she had learned to leave those alone until they passed, which they did, because he was not a man who stayed in his own darkness without working his way out. They were imperfect with each other the way real people are imperfect. Not the kind of imperfect that signals damage, but the kind that signals presence. They were both there, both fully themselves, and themselves were not without edges. She thought sometimes about what Roland Hargrove had decided about her, from a letter written by a man who wanted her gone. She thought about what kind of life a different version of herself might have had, reduced to the width of someone's existing needs, her intelligence a feature rather than a force, her capability tolerated rather than used. She did not think about this with bitterness. She thought about it the way you think about a road you didn't take, not with regret exactly, but with a clear-eyed awareness that the road you did take was yours in a way the other one would never have been. Well, the Territorial Education Office approved the secondary school proposal in October. Calhoun read the approval letter at the community meeting, and this time the room was not quiet with the cautious stillness of people afraid to move too fast. This time Gus Teller said, "Well, that took long enough," and everyone laughed, and Hector Luce's youngest son banged the table with his hand, and Polly Morrow, who was there because Martha had brought her and Martha went everywhere now, as though she had decided that life was too short to stay home when things were happening, looked around at the laughing adults with her serious face, and then decided, after a moment of consideration, to laugh too. Trace Teller, sitting next to his father for the first time in a year at one of these meetings. Something had shifted between them over the past months, some thaw that had happened through proximity, and Gus slowly, grudgingly acknowledging that his son was someone worth paying attention to, looked at the letter in Calhoun's hand and said nothing, but his face was doing the thing faces do when something you have been working toward for a long time becomes real before you've fully prepared yourself for it. After the meeting, he found Abigail outside. "The secondary program," he said. "When does it start?" "January," she said. "If we can find a second teacher by then." "I can help," he said, "with the younger students, so you have time for the secondary work." She looked at him. He was 16, nearly 17, and stood now at the full height he was going to be, which was considerable. He had his father's directness and something else, something that had been in him when she arrived, and that the past 8 months had given room to develop, a quality of attention that was going to serve him extremely well in whatever he decided to do with his life. "I know you can," she said. "I was going to ask you." He nodded, with the controlled satisfaction that was his characteristic response to things going the way he'd hoped. "My father thinks I should go east for proper schooling," he said. "Eventually." "Your father's right," she said. He looked at her with mild surprise. "You think I should leave?" "I think you should learn everything this settlement can teach you, and then go learn things it can't," she said. "And I think you should come back when you're done, because Iron Hollow is going to need what you'll know by then." She paused. "But that's years away. Right now you have algebra to teach 7-year-olds. He almost smiled. "That's a significant come down from going east." "Most important work is," she said. The first snow of winter came in November, earlier than usual, and Iron Hollow woke to find itself transformed. The familiar outlines softened, the distance shortened, the usual sounds of the settlement muffled into something that felt, briefly, like the world holding its breath. Abigail stood at the east window of the study in the early morning and watched it come down. And Silas was somewhere behind her in the house doing something practical, because Silas always had something practical to do, and the schoolhouse was visible at the settlement's north end with its light already on inside, because Trace had been there at first light as always, and the smoke was rising from the Morrow house and the Loose house and the store chimney. She had been in Iron Hollow for 11 months. She thought about the woman who had sat on a trunk at a train station in Cutter's Bend, reading a rejection note from a man who hadn't waited to see her face. That woman had been 26 years old and had $11.40 and a trunk full of books she'd packed for a life she intended to build somewhere. She had not been broken by that platform, though it had felt like the end of something. She had not been made smaller by what Gerald Pruitt had said about her, though she hadn't known then how not to be. What she understood now, standing at the window of a house she had helped design in a settlement she had helped hold together, was that the rejection at Cutter's Bend had not been the worst thing that could have happened to her. It had been painful, and it had been unfair, and the person who caused it had known exactly what he was doing and had done it anyway. All of that was true, and it had put her on a horse headed toward Iron Hollow, which was the truest thing she could say about what had come after. She did not believe that suffering was designed to lead somewhere. She did not believe that things worked out because they were meant to. She believed that people did the work and made the choices and built what they could with what they had, and that sometimes, not always, not reliably, not without cost, what they built was worth more than what they'd lost. She believed this not as comfort, but as fact, the way she believed in land records and certified documents and the specific power of something written down and witnessed. Silas appeared in the doorway. He looked at the snow and then at her. "School's still on?" he said. "School is still on," she said. "In this?" "Children in Iron Hollow have seen snow before," she said. "Also, Trace is already there." He looked at her with the expression that had replaced the near smile, the full version, the one she got now with some regularity and had stopped taking for granted. "You want coffee before you go?" "I want coffee," she said. She turned away from the window. The study was warm from the small stove in the corner, and her desk had the papers she'd been working on the previous evening, a curriculum outline for the secondary program, which she'd revised 3 times and was going to revise at least once more before January. The books were on the shelf. Her mother's brooch, which she had not sold after all, had found, at the last minute, a different thing to sell, was on the small table by the window, the only object in the room that was not practical. She picked up the brooch as she passed, as she sometimes did in the mornings, and held it for a moment. Her mother had worn it every Sunday of Abigail's childhood. It was not valuable in any market sense. It was the last piece of a life she had come from, carried into a life she had chosen, and keeping it did not mean she was still in that first life. It meant she knew where she'd been and wasn't ashamed of it. She set it back down and went to find the coffee. And in the spring, a woman arrived in Iron Hollow on the Prescott supply wagon, alone, with a single bag, the look of someone who had been traveling hard and sleeping badly and had arrived somewhere without being entirely sure what she'd find. She was perhaps 30, brown-haired, with the particular bearing of a person trying very hard to appear more settled than she was. Abigail saw her from the schoolhouse doorway. She told Trace to carry on with the reading group and walked out to the main track. "Are you looking for someone?" she said. The woman looked at her. "I was told there might be work here. Teaching. I came from Denver. I have references from a school there." She stopped, as though she'd rehearsed this and it wasn't coming out the way she'd practiced. "I'm sorry. I don't know who to talk to. I was told to ask for a Mr. Calhoun or a Miss Whitmore." "I'm Abigail Whitmore," she said. The woman blinked. "Oh." Something in her face relaxed slightly, the specific relaxation of a person who has arrived at the right door and is not quite willing to believe it yet. "I'm Margaret Hale. My situation in Denver changed and I needed to—" She stopped. "I needed to start somewhere new." Abigail looked at her for a moment. She thought about a train platform. She thought about $11.40. She thought about a letter from a man she'd never met that had said, "I can offer you honest wages, a room of your own, and a community that will judge you by what you do." "Come inside," she said. "Tell me about your references, and I'll tell you about the school." Margaret Hale looked at her with the expression of a woman who is trying not to let herself hope too quickly, which was a recognizable expression. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Abigail said. "I have questions." She held the schoolhouse door open, and Margaret Hale walked through it, and behind them Iron Hollow went on in the ordinary way of places that have decided to persist. The store, the livery, the houses, the smoke from the chimneys, the sound of children's voices from inside the building, reciting something in unison. The words not quite audible from the doorway, but the rhythm of it clear and steady and real.